So, basic structure 3. What do we know? The Electoral College, right, separates the popular vote from the actual vote for who gets to be president. And we're going to talk about why people vote and how people vote. This is just kind of to whet your appetite for what most of Module 2 is about. Republicans have only won the popular vote 2 times in the last 9 presidential elections, but they've been president 4 times because of the Electoral College. Right? That's only in the United States has that happened, that you can win the vote but lose the election. Okay, so the Electoral College also does something very wacky. And what it does is most states, in fact, there are more than 20 states that have voted for the same party every election since the 80s. Then there's another group of states that have gotten much more solidified. So California used to be a state up for grabs, and Florida used to be a state up for grabs, and really neither one of them seems to be anymore. The last 3 elections have been decided in these states. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 states, and those 7 states, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those 7 states, right? Ohio used to be a swing state. It doesn't seem to be swingy anymore, right? It's these 7 states. In the last 3 elections, these 7 states have decided that election by less than 250,000 votes total. So Donald Trump won the first time with 77,000 vote margin. 77,000 votes out of 140 million votes that were cast. 77,000. If there are people who talk about third party, we need a third. If the people who voted for the Green Party in those 7 states, the Green Party, which is the environmental party, if those people had voted for Hillary, if they had not voted for the Green Party and voted for Hillary, Hillary Clinton would have won the election. Right? The Green Party is an extremely liberal party where the environmental concerns are number 1. And yet, who are their biggest donors? The answer is rich Republicans, because the rich Republicans know that the Green Party takes votes away from the Democrats and doesn't take votes away from the Republicans. So we have a bizarre election system. Joe Biden, even though he won the popular vote by many millions, he won by about 130,000 votes across these 7 states. And you may remember that Donald Trump was calling secretaries of state and asking them to just to give him 11,000 votes or give him however many votes. And there were 3 recounts in Arizona. There were 3 recounts in Georgia. There were multiple recounts up in Michigan. None of the recounts changed the outcome. In fact, all of them actually gave Joe Biden more votes. So the only evidence of votes being not counted right was that that Joe Biden votes weren't counted. But we'll get back to that. And then in this election, it was about 230,000 votes across those 7 states. So we have 150 million people who are voting now, which it's a bad number, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if you have 150 million people who are voting, these elections should not be decided by 80 or 90 or 150,000 votes across 7 states. It should be the entirety of the country that's deciding the election, and that's just not happening. And again, we'll talk about why that is, right? Why this is, and why, but why? Okay, so let's look at how we vote. And again, this is just a teaser. We're going to talk about economic theory that tells us about elections, and we're going to do that in the next round. But I wanted to try to I just wanted to give you a little idea of how these things go. So if we look at the 1,000 eligible voters in the United States in this election that just happened in November, 360 of them didn't vote. So didn't vote got more votes than Trump. Didn't vote got more votes than Kamala Harris. Didn't vote is the biggest group. 5 million people who voted for Joe Biden stayed home. If those 5 million people who voted for Joe Biden had come and voted for Kamala Harris, she'd be the president. So it's our election is more determined by who doesn't vote than they're determined by who does vote. So of the 1,000 eligible voters, 315 voted for Trump and 305 voted for Harris. That's how close this was, right? This was the second closest election in the last 50 years in the popular vote. Extremely close in the popular vote. And again, I'm not going to pick on my fellow Americans, but there was a shocking number of people who didn't vote because they didn't think a woman could be president, that a woman can do the job. And it's embarrassing to me that India has elected a woman to run their democracy and the United States hasn't. It's just sad to me that so many people seem to think that women can't handle stuff. It's sad. Sad. I wrote a science fiction novel. That was my lifetime goal, was to be a novelist. I wrote a couple novels. Nobody bought them, but I wrote them anyhow. The most common thing people said in my reviews, despite the fact that they knew that the hero of my novels was a female starship captain, was that women couldn't be starship captains. It was a great book, but women aren't cut out to be starship captains. And why you would buy a book with a woman starship captain if you don't like women starship captains, I don't know. But I don't understand why so many people seem to think women can't do what women can obviously do. Okay, so some other stuff. Supreme Court justices, there's 9 of them. There's nothing in the Constitution about how many they are. In the 1800s, and we'll talk about this too, the Republicans added seats to the Supreme Court because they wanted to take control of the Supreme Court away from the Democrats, and so they did it by adding seats. And nowadays we call that packing the court, and it's the Republicans who are opposed to it. But they get a lifetime appointment. And so they stay on there. Sometimes we know that they're not really kind of up to it, or they're sick or whatever, and they can just stay, right? And there's nothing in the Constitution doesn't say it has to be a lifetime appointment, and we really won't talk about that. It's not our job, but it's quite possible that the thing to do is to change the Supreme Court. The best thing, one of the better things we could do would be to make the Supreme Court not a lifetime appointment. But again, we'll talk more about the Supreme Court. So there's a bunch of appeals courts that are below the Supreme Court, and there are also a bunch of other federal trial courts. Donald Trump set a record in terms of how many justices he's appointed to those courts, and then Joe Biden broke that record of how many justices you appoint to that court. You would think it shouldn't make a difference, right? Courts are supposed to rule on the facts and the Constitution and the law, and yet it does matter, right? So Donald Trump gets caught with a lot of boxes of documents he wasn't supposed to have. He could have gotten them. Part of the point there is you can get them back. The law says you give them to the National Archives, and then you ask for them back, and the National Archives can give them back to you. So Obama has millions of documents that he got back from the National Archives that are going to go in a library eventually and blah, blah, blah. But if you just take them and you take classified documents and all this other stuff, it's a problem. Okay? Well, the judge who was assigned to hear his case was somebody he appointed. And got repeatedly, I won't go through the whole deal, but because it took way too long. Let me just say that. They just stalled, right? They stalled and hoped that he was going to win. And when he won, now that case is gone because you can't prosecute a sitting president. If he had stayed, there'd been a trial, and we'd have all gotten to see the evidence and hear him testify and figure out what really went on. But we can't, we won't, we never will. Federal courts hear federal crimes. Federal courts, the appeals of a state court sometimes can go into the federal courts. And so the trials that Hay had in New York, which were state trials where he was convicted of 34 felonies, those trials, he's appealed some of that stuff to the federal, and the federals kicked it back and said, no, that's all state business. There's nothing no constitutional violations in what happened there. So that includes the Supreme Court, by the way, has said that all stands. And yeah. By the way, and I should have said this first, none of those courts are listed in the Constitution. So the Congress gets to create all the lower level courts and decide how many there are. There used to be so again, we had stuff on this at the beginning. The point of this is there needs to be balance, right? There needs to be balance. The three parts of government should be balancing each other out so none of them get wacky and do things that they're not supposed to do, right? The Supreme Court basically has said now the president can't be prosecuted even if they violate the law. So the president can do things that are illegal and get away with it now. And people were yelling at Joe Biden to do some illegal crap in his last few months as president to, block Trump from doing stuff or whatever, do some illegal stuff. And he didn't. But any president in the future now is not bound by law unless we get a new Supreme Court that changes that. But they're not bound by law, and they can do bad stuff. And it flies in the face of this whole idea of there needs to be a balance and a separation of powers among the three branches of government. They're supposed to be co-equal, as we say, but not really now. So we're going to start talking about So now our next phase of all of this is to talk about how voting happens and why people vote a certain way. And we have a whole economic theory that people have actually won the Nobel Prize for developing a whole economic theory about how people vote and why they vote the way they do. And, if you don't understand that I kind of hate all politicians, then you don't understand that. But it's pretty clear that one of the two parties understands that theory way better than the others. That the theory seems to be right, at least in my book, the theory seems to be right. And one of our two parties gets the theory, and one of our two parties doesn't.